I asked you to read the story of David and Goliath as a way to kind of get into this question of strategy. So what did you take from David and Goliath? Why David and Goliath?
You have to realize like what your resources are. Like you can't, for example, in the story specifically, how they try to place this armor and shield, and basically it's something that David wasn't used to wearing. He was familiar with the sling and the rock, so he used those resources as best as he could.
So the lesson you would take from that for strategy is
try to listen to other people, but really have to think about what are your strengths and try and push those forward.
no, that's good. That's good. What else? Yes.
You have to make it real.
So
Think
this
of strategy as something practical you can use.
so this goes with Jordan's point. I mean, in other words, for David to have gone in with the sword and the shield wouldn't have been a very practical thing for him, right? It's not something he could do. I mean, so he had to come up with a way that could work for him, given who he was and what he could do. David gets outraged, right, about the offense to the ranks of the living God, and the question of practicality doesn't come up at all. In fact, it becomes clear later on he doesn't even know what his plan is. So his first decision is what? He's going to engage. The reason the motivation stuff is so important is that it's out of that commitment, that motivation. What happens when you find yourself in harm's way? What happens to your focus? You pay attention. You really, that anxiety, you pay attention, you focus. And see, starting with this commitment, as David does, starting with the motivation, say, okay, I'm going to do this. So now I've put myself in a situation where it really matters to me.
He used to kill lions, so he had this salient knowledge, like, okay, I know how to do it. And then this heuristic process of going from a lion to a giant.
Yeah.
So
That's
he had all of
summarizes
it.
it. So three pieces: the motivation, the salient knowledge, and the creative recontextualizing. What did the king tell him? Yeah.
He told him to wear the armor and take the sword.
Don't you often get conventional wisdom about how to deal with the powerful?
Mm-hmm.
That the way you deal with the powerful is to do more of whatever they're doing? If you're going to fight Goliath, so what you need is what Goliath has, weapons. Little problem. Goliath's a lot better at it. He has more of it, right? Why do we listen to it? Why did David listen to it? And this guy was the king, right? Powerful people give you advice. I mean, you better pay attention, right? But that's without looking at the question that several people mentioned, the question of, who am I? What do I have?
It also seems to be a question of schema. Like
Yeah.
there's like if you go there's the schema. If you go fight in a battle, then you wear this and you do that, and you have to get rid of that schema before you can think of something else.
So then why was David able to make that move? And see, he wasn't trained as a warrior. He was the only non-soldier present. Okay, think about that for a minute. See, everybody there was in exactly, that institutionalized understanding, right? This is what a soldier does. This is how it works. This is what we do. It's schema. And so David, because he was the outsider, could see with different eyes. And we talked before about the insider-outsider combination and why that can be so powerful. But David could see with different eyes. David didn't build a strategy around something he didn't know how to do, though, did he? He was an expert. And that's important not to lose either. I mean, he built a strategy around something he was an expert at. He had it, And so it's not just like having a vague idea. It's kind of like really understanding what you're good at and getting good at it and building on what you're good at. And how did Goliath react? What happened when David goes and confronts Goliath? What did Goliath do? Yeah, ha, 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 right? And in the middle of the third ha, the stone goes right before it. And there you go. Caesar used to say, power makes you stupid. And what he meant was, that there is a kind of arrogance, that there's a kind of an arrogance and resistance to learning, thinking you don't need to learn, that you know how to do it, that's associated with having had access to lots of resources. You begin to rely on those resources. And so you're confronted with something novel or something different like David, and you don't take it seriously. And so then that creates the opening. That creates the opportunity for the resourceful to defeat the one with the resourced, right?
David felt like, so he had the Lord's support, which I think is a huge influence. He basically sounded like he was invincible, like, oh, I'm gonna win, like, he was taunting Goliath, and I wouldn't want to call it a sense of arrogance, but he was very sure of himself as well. But does that play more to motivation versus some other qualities?
This is a great question. How do you distinguish between David's confidence and Goliath's confidence? What's the difference? Yeah, Helen.
I think part of that in David's story is that outlook, that constructing your own narrative, and the way that he was able to kind of view the situation with a positive strength.
So there's some like self-knowledge involved there.
Yeah.
Is he a guy full of certainty about how he was going to do it? No. See, what's interesting is he has the courage and the motivation to put himself in the situation, and his confidence seems to be in that he could learn how to do it. There's a kind of confidence associated with knowing how to do a particular routine of something. Like, say, a teacher who knows how to do the lesson plan, okay? And your confidence rests in that routine. There's a deeper level where you know that there's multiple routines. And you have learned that you can learn what to do in that circumstance. That's when you become a teacher as opposed to a person who runs a lesson plan. And because that confidence is very fragile. The other confidence, the deep confidence, is very important. And I think it does connect to self-knowledge. And I think for David it connects to his connection to God. In the story, now you can interpret that religiously, you can interpret it non-religiously in the sense that he's able to access sources of motivation, transcendence, energy, that lifts him up and allows him to face a situation where he doesn't have all the answers, but he doesn't lose himself. He actually mobilizes himself to find the answers.
I also sort of think of it as David could see the outcome before the outcome was before him, and I take that, from listening to different people, like athletes who say they run the race before the race, and they see themselves winning the gold medal.
I'll strike you down and cut off your head today. I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth.
Pretty specific.
And the whole
Very concrete, yeah.
He knows. But the key is that he says that he's going to do it in the Lord's strength, that he's not going to rely on the same weapons as Goliath was relying on. And
See,
so he derives his motivation from something bigger than himself.
There's a paradox there, or an apparent paradox of confidence and humility, right? In other words, recognizing his limitations, his confidence in the source of his moral energy allows him to see much more clearly. In other words, because he doesn't get stuck in sort of an inflated idea of who he is and what he knows how to do. Recognizing our limitations is not to not have confidence. The confidence is associated with recognizing our limitations and yet knowing that we can deal with it, believing that we can deal with it, having the faith that we can. So the link between motivation and strategy is much deeper than sometimes people think. In fact, sometimes people argue that the motivational stuff is crazy and irrational, and we need to keep that under control so we can do good analysis and good strategy. And my argument is that it's just the opposite. That's what fuels the capacity to do good strategy. So what is strategy? Turning what you have into what you need, which is usually power of some kind or another, to get what you want, an outcome, what you're trying to achieve. It's your imagination of how you're going to take the resources that you have over here. How are you going to take those resources, and what are you going to do with them in order to accomplish the outcome that you're trying to accomplish? And the specific activities that you undertake to do that, well, those are the tactics. The word comes from the Greek. Strata was an army. I mean, strata is a word for plane, and so an army was deployed on a plane, so it was called a strata. And so the general was called the strategos, who was like up on the hill, responsible for figuring out how to achieve the outcome which was desired, which was victory. And so then he had troops to deploy down here, and I can't ask you what they were called because it's written right up here on the sign. These were the tacticas. See, the ranks of soldiers were called tacticas. And so the strategos deployed the tacticas. What makes a good tactic or a bad tactic? A petition campaign, is that a good tactic? Depends on what? Huh? Okay, the outcome, and what else does it depend on? Your own resources, right. So what kind of outcome are you trying to achieve? What resources do you have? So it may be a good tactic, it may not be a good tactic. It depends on whether it moves the strategy forward. We really get screwed up on this stuff sometimes. It's like, oh, somebody does something we don't like, so now we're going to have a picket line. Or now we're going to send letters to so-and-so. I mean, we have these kind of very institutionalized versions of swords and of tactics, and we sort of say, oh, let's do that, without thinking. Well, what is the connection between that and what we're trying to accomplish and what we have? And it's just just reflect about organizational experiences you've had that wind up where the tactics drive the strategy, where people say, oh, we know how to do that, so we'll do that, without a real analysis of what's the theory. How is it that doing that is going to actually influence the other?
In my project particularly, the tactics that we're choosing are the ones that are most accessible to us. So that might not be the best ones, but they're the ones that are most immediately available.
In terms of your resources, those are appealing tactics. But then what else do you have to look at?
The bigger picture, I guess.
Well, what else? If you think of that as one half of the thing, okay, that gets you from here to here. But what does she have to do then for that second part?
Like a million
No. What's the strategic task to do? One end of it is, okay, our resources equip us to do these things. But over here, you got to have a theory of how you're going to make that outcome happen. In other words, who can decide over here? What influences them? What are their interests, right? Takes you back to the question of what? What resources do we have that can influence their interests? Remember the power analysis thing? And so you've got to close the loop. There's a theoretical component of all the practice that we do, which is simply our imagination, using our imagination to imagine ways through things. To devise a good strategy, then, requires intimate knowledge of your resources is one thing. The other very specific thing it requires is clarity about your outcome. How would you go about building a building if you knew that, trying to figure out the best way to build a building, if your picture of the building you were building was sort of a generic building? Okay? I'm going to build a building. Okay? Well, I know I need some money. But is it 3 stories? Is it 1 story? Is it commercial? Is it residential? Don't you have to answer all those questions to be able to actually figure out what? Well, so now if you shift over to our kinds of, the kinds of work that we're doing, what's the equivalent, of an outcome that's really concrete and specific that you can really be clear about?
With me, with the ed pick, my vision is to create this semester so that next year in orientation there'll be a bunch of people who are there with resources and a conference.
Describe the orientation.
Probably, Star Auditorium filled with, I would say, 50 to 60 people, professors involved, and an outline for the upcoming year, and I kind of have this vision of just a lot of people with an interest in education and some strategic partners and community groups that would be there and kind of realize this is the resources with a list of courses and options and a handbook for people to actually think about, who are interested in education, to think about, the things that are available to them, not only here, but at other schools too. So
And this would be, how long a session would this be?
Hour. Just, it would be an hour probably followed by a half-hour reception.
Oh, so there'd be food?
Pizza. Yeah. People like food. I like food. Food works. But that's definitely something I would
Now,
think of.
what's happening as she gets more and more specific about this?
Oh, I'm like, when is it happening?
Yeah, right. That's one thing.
That's the fall.
It has tremendous motivational power.
Yeah.
See, because it's you can picture it. It wasn't, in the Exodus, it's not like go to this promised land. It was there will be milk, there will be honey. It's very, very specific. You can imagine it, you can see it. It becomes real in your imagination. So certainly it's motivationally powerful. What else as she got more and more specific?
There was light in her face.
The enthusiasm.
Boy, you could pick up her enthusiasm, right? Because she was seeing it. What else? Yeah.
Well, with everything she mentioned, it became clear what you needed to do to get there. Like when you say you want to have a handbook, well, you got to produce it somehow.
Yeah.
You want professors involved, well, you got to get them involved somehow. So
Yeah.
I guess for you, by describing it better, you know what the elements are that you need to make this happen, and then you can strategize.
Yeah. If you don't do that work of fleshing out concretely and specifically, well, then you're kind of wandering around and where do we focus, and now why don't we do more of that?
Even if there's that kind of 10% doubt of, is this really what I want to do? Maybe I want to go in another direction. It's going to be really difficult to sell followers or other people on the goal.
I think there's a reticence to commit, actually, that may hold us back, where it feels like, well, if we get that specific and concrete, then we kind of really have to make it happen. And if we have to change, well, then that's a bad thing. And this may be a bad example, but the airlines, they do these elaborate schedules, right? What do they know when they're doing the schedule? What do they know for certain?
You're not going to be able to follow it.
Yeah, it's going to change, right? So then why do they do it? They know it's going to change, so why do they do it?
People need, because they don't people want it.
Yeah, but why else? Why do they do it?
What's the point to start from?
Yeah, and see, that way, so along comes a storm front, right, or something, and then you can be mindful about what you're changing. You can then adapt because you have a framework to handle the changes and the uncertainty. The clearer you are about the outcome that you're trying to accomplish, the easier it is for you to handle change because you can adapt. When do you do strategy? Always. Yeah, you do it all the time. It's strategic action. It's not strategic planning. What you can do usefully on strategic planning is get a common picture. Get everybody on board, seeing the same outcome. That's very useful. And you can kind of see where you are and all that's great. But it's not a prediction of the future. The real strategic talent shows once you start encountering all those unexpected things that happen. And it's your then capacity to mindfully adapt so that you're still moving towards your objective, changing what you need to change, responding to what you need to respond to. That's where the real action is in strategy. Alinsky said the action is in the reaction. Well, what do these people know? Where are they? They're right there on the battlefield. Boy, they know kind of what's going on. What does this person know?
The big picture.
Yeah. And see, the tension is that you have to have both. A good strategy in one setting is different than a good strategy in another setting because it's all about the specifics, what's really there in terms of resources and opportunities. So there's a requirement of real intimate knowledge of detail, but not getting stuck in the detail, being able then to put it in perspective. Strategic is the opposite of habitual or reactive. Okay? In other words, to just respond to a situation as you always do, which is what Goliath did, that's habitual response. It's not thinking. It's not mindful. It's not cognizant of the circumstances, right? Or just kind of getting angry, or that's not thinking either. So it's this middle ground of being able to mindfully consider where you are, consider your alternatives, and that can be a very lonely place. It can be a scary place because you become conscious of the significance of the choices that you're making. It's like moving the fulcrum, okay, on the balance. In other words, it's like moving the point of leverage, literally, by being resourceful and by figuring out how to do that. So this creative, resourceful component of power is very important, and it's particularly important for those that are challenging the status quo. Because the preponderance of resources will always be on the other side. one way to think about, to break it down a little bit so you can get more focus to doing strategy. There are always questions of targeting, okay? And targeting meaning just choice. In other words, okay, you never have enough resources, right? That's a given. Never have enough resources. So then, what do you have to do? You have to choose how to use the resources that you have. Strategy requires you to choose, to say, we're going to do this, but not these 6 things. We're going to do that one. Why do you have to make that choice? You don't have enough resources to do all 6 things. But then that's scary, right? Because you've got to commit to this. It might be the wrong choice. Better not to make a choice. Let's just do everything. I mean, and you know, and you better make a choice, and if it doesn't work, you change it. A second consideration is timing. Timing. What do you do first? What do you do second? What do you do third? Are there things that if you do first, make it possible for you to do something else second, right? Or are there things if you do it first, you can't, it precludes doing so. There's sort of sequences. There's also opportunities, and opportunities are very, very important. I mean, opportunities, the way I'm going to think, an opportunity is like something that happens outside your control that all of a sudden increases the value of your resources. I mean, it's like, so if you have a grain storage, and all of a sudden there's a famine, you didn't do anything, but all of a sudden your grain storage is worth a lot. Those kinds of opportunities occur in time. And so timing in strategy is a very important sort of recognizing when you're going to have the maximum influence. And then, of course, the choice of tactics. At all levels of a plan, okay, if you're talking about short-term, medium-term, long-term, if you're talking about local, regional, national, at all levels of a strategic activity, strategy is involved, okay? It's not like strategy is done up here, but not down here. Or strategy is long-term, but not short-term. See, what varies are the outcomes. Now, you may be working on a long-term outcome, medium-range outcome, short-term outcome, a local outcome, a state outcome, a national outcome. Strategy always involves then being clear about what the outcome is you're trying to produce. You're always building on resources that you have, and you're always trying to figure out how do you use those resources to produce that outcome, okay? So there's a strategic element to planning your next meeting, right? And there's a strategic element to planning how you're going to change the world. Strategy is the result of teams, of interactions, of people consulting with other people. And who's part of that matters a whole lot. Whether you have a mix of people, whether you have people that know the detail and know the big picture, the whole thing matters a whole lot. Because what you're trying to do is create a team, a context for strategizing that includes motivated people, that includes relevant knowledge, and that includes a way to creatively learn. And one of the things we learn is that the more diversity, the more the creativity. And so it's a kind of a dilemma, because usually the more diverse a team is, the more creative it will be, but the harder time it'll have performing. Okay? And so there's a tension there to balance and to figure. And I just want to read you a short thing here of how we strategized the march to Sacramento. We were striking in Delano. We've been on strike for the winter, and we had figured out we were going to do a boycott of Schenley Industries, a big liquor company. We didn't know if the boycott was working or not. It was wintertime. It's very grim in Delano in wintertime. And so people's morale was not great. And so Cesar got a bunch of us together, went over to Santa Barbara, where our morale went up immediately, because that's over on the coast where it's sunny. But and the idea was to figure out, so what do we do? How do we move this thing forward? As proposals flew around the room, someone suggested we follow the example of New Mexico miners who traveled to New York to set up a mining camp in front of the company headquarters on Wall Street. Farm workers could travel to Schenley headquarters in New York, set up a labor camp out front, and maintain a vigil until Schenley signed. Schenley was this liquor company, owned 4,000 acres of grapes in Delano. We thought the Kennedy family owned it. They didn't, but it became a good target for us. Farm workers could travel to Schenley. Okay. Someone else then suggested they go by bus, so rallies could be held all across the country, local boycott committees organized, and publicity generated, building momentum for the arrival in New York. Then why not march instead of going by bus, someone else asked, as Dr. King had done the previous year, which was Selma to Montgomery. But it's too far from Delano to New York, someone countered. On the other hand, the Schenley headquarters in San Francisco might not be too far. about 280 miles, which an Army veteran present calculated to be done at the rate of 15 miles a day, or in about 20 days. But what if Shenley doesn't respond, Chavez asked. Why not march to Sacramento instead and put the heat on Governor Brown to intervene and get negotiations started? He's up for re-election, wants the votes of our supporters, so perhaps we can have more impact if we use him as leverage. Yes, someone else said, and on the way to Sacramento, the march could pass through most of the farm worker towns. Taking a page from Mao Zedong's Long March, we could organize local committees and get pledges not to break the strike sign. Yes, and we could get them to feed us and house us. Someone said. And just as Zapata wrote his Plan de Ayala, which is like a manifesto in the Mexican Revolution for Liberation, Luis Valdez suggested we can write a Plan de Delano, read it in each town, ask local farm workers to sign it, and to carry it to the next town. Then Chavez asked, why should it be a march at all? It will be Lent soon, a time for reflection, for penance, for asking forgiveness. Perhaps ours should be a pilgrimage, a peregrinación, which could arrive at Sacramento on Easter Sunday. And that's what happened. And the march, as it got going out of Delano, it got more, it began to get more and more attention, publicity, people coming to it, bishops authorizing people to go participate, being struck with the sacrifice of the whole thing. And 3 days south of Sacramento, the phone rang, and it was Shenley's lawyers saying that they didn't want to risk our turning this into a huge anti-Shenley thing in Sacramento when we got there. So they wanted to sign a contract with the union. So when we got to Sacramento, we had the first really farm labor contract in history in California. And we had 10,000 people there, and quite a celebration, as you might imagine. So this is like a flavor of how strategy can work and be done when you've got a mixed set of people around the table.